Super God Gene. Chapter 21. In addition to Han Sen, Son of Heaven and his gang were also joined by a few thugs they paid to come along. The group left Steel Armor Shelter and marched into the mountains. Although they expected nothing good to happen, they still wanted to take the chance for the sake of the generous reward. In the past, if Han Sen had not been blocked by Qin Zan and Son of Heaven, he might also have risked his life for the bounty. Now Han Sen had no reason to take such risks, but it was clear that Son of Heaven and Luo Tianyang wanted to use him as a stepping stone, which made him want to kill them both. Han Sen quietly followed them, guessing what they were about to do. When recruiting people, the gang had said they were hunting a mutant creature, and it was only because there were also many ordinary and primitive creatures that they needed more hands. Han Sen of course couldn't take this seriously. To kill a mutant creature, the regular gang was more than enough. The dozen people around Son of Heaven could all kill a mutant creature on their own, let alone Son of Heaven himself. The extra hands were completely unnecessary, according to their story. Luo Tianyang and others casually killed the creatures they encountered along the way, and gave the meat to the hired people casually, which made everyone quite happy. The group had been going for 6 or 7 days, and the gang still had no intention of stopping. On the 8th day, they halted at a mountain pass. Very far from the shelter, there was no human activity. They encountered many different creatures. Son of Heaven and his gang had killed a lot of primitive animals on the way and kept some of the flesh as food. It seems that we are almost there. What on earth are they up to? Han Sen had not heard anything, but judging from the grave look on their faces, this couldn't be a simple operation. They rested for a day at the campsite and crossed the mountain pass the next morning. After hiking a dozen miles, they saw a gap in the canyon so deep and dark that no one could see the bottom. Everyone lit a torch. The gang sent the hired people as the vanguard and followed them into the gap. The hired ones all knew it was time to put their life on the line, so they were dawdling. "Why are you going so slowly, bitches? Do you still want the rest of the money?" Luo Tianyang whipped a few people in the back and shouted. The thugs could only speed up going down. Han Sen was among them. It was not too difficult to walk down, and nothing happened along the way until they reached the bottom. The thugs were relieved and started to talk and laugh again. It was very dark at the bottom of the gap, and the group had to rely on the torches. There was an underground river running through the huge space. Cross the river and go into the cave on the other side. Luo Tianyang pointed his whip to the other side. "Luo, I cannot swim. This river is too wide," said a young man who had been recruited. "Who told you to swim? We have inflatable boats. Just row across." Luo Tianyang opened the parcel on the back of his mount, and there were indeed inflatable boats in there. After they inflated the boats, each one could sit 4 to 5 people. The group started to row the boats across. The speed of the water was not fast, and there was no risk of being rushed downstream. 2 boats soon reached the center of the river. All of a sudden, with a splash, a dark creature emerged from the water with half of its python-like body exposed. Its body was wider than a bucket and covered with shiny black fine scales. Its mouth was so large that it could fit a cow. But it wasn't a cow that was swallowed, rather someone on the boat. The giant body then put its full weight on the boat, which exploded with everyone on it falling into the water. Everyone was shocked and trying to row the boats back. Those who hadn't gone on the boat just dropped their boat and started to run back. With a glint of cold steel, the 2 running the fastest were beheaded by Luo Tianyang and another gang member. Luo Tianyang pointed the knife with blood on it at the rest and cried ruthlessly, "There is but one monster, so whoever reaches the other side can live. And I'll kill anyone who took the money and tries to run away. To live or to die, it is up to you." Everyone was intimidated by Luo Tianyang's vicious act and started to row towards the other side. "Assholes, you just want to feed the monster with humans," Han Sen cursed in his heart. Those who fell into the water before were trying to swim to the other side but were suddenly pulled into the water by something. It was so dark that no one saw what happened to them, but their fate could be imagined from the thick scent of blood. The hired boys dared not move forward, and Luo Tianyang used his knife again to force them. They didn't want to stay in the river, so they had to row hard. Han Sen lit the surroundings with his torch while rowing the boat. In case the monster came out of the water, he had to summon Sacred Blood Beast Soul Armor at once to save his life. The monster again collapsed a boat, and everyone on it was screaming. Then what could be heard was only the waves rolling. "Row harder if you want to live." Han Sen yelled at the 2 on the boat with him who were petrified as he was rowing his heart out. King Heartless Bastards. He swore quietly. The 2 men were revived by Han Sen's shout, and started to row desperately. From time to time there were screams and splashes. Countless men must have been buried in the snake belly. Super God Gene. Chapter 22. There was no doubt that this giant snake was a sacred blood creature. Aquatic creatures were hard enough to kill, let alone a sacred blood creature. With his normal gang, Son of Heaven didn't even dare to hunt it, but was only trying to fill out the group, so that they could safely reach the other side. Han Sen took a look at the other side as he was rowing. After they passed the middle of the river, the torch could light up the other side a little bit. Since Han Sen had started to practice Jideskin, his body function seemed to get a lot better. Vision was also a lot stronger than before and he seemed to have gained night vision as well. Now he could clearly see a cave 6 to 9 feet wide on a cliff. Although there was no path, the cave must have been the gang's destination. Han Sen was looking at the cave when he heard a loud splash. His heart sank as he saw the giant snake popping out of water less than 6 feet from their boat, its mouth moving towards the boat and its fangs showing. Without thinking, Han Sen jumped into the water and summoned his armor underwater. Like a fish, he struggled to swim across the river. The whole process of crossing the river was tragic. It wasn't clear whether the black snake was insatiable or just determined to kill humans, but only 2 boats reached the other side, and only 7 people lived. All the others were in the water and most likely dead. The snake didn't show up again. Son of Heaven, although the snake was a sacred blood creature, it was not intelligent. Now it is full, we should not have too much risk crossing, said Luo Tianyang, smiling. Go over. Son of Heaven gave the order, and the gang went over in 3 boats. As expected, the snake didn't attack anymore and they all landed safely. Continue. Luo Tianyang whipped the 7 survivors, who were forced to walk inside the cave, trembling. They regretted so much that they had coveted the bounty. What was money good for if they died here? But they did not encounter any other creatures along the way. In half an hour, they reached the end of the cave. At the end of the cave there was a pool, and next to the pool was a gravel nest 30 feet wide. In the middle of the nest there lay 2 eggs the size of ostrich eggs with black patterns. Son of Heaven was overjoyed. Ha ha, awesome, eggs of sacred blood creatures, and there are 2 of them. Now my sacred geno points could go over 80. Even so, he did not lose his caution and winked at Luo Tianyang, who was equally excited. The latter understood immediately and forced the survivors to fetch the eggs. Trembling, they walked into the gravel nest and carried out the 2 eggs. However, before they were able to leave the nest, the pool started to bubble, and bang! A huge snake head stuck out, the dark red snake eyes staring at the egg thieves. Damn, throw the eggs over, Son of Heaven shouted to them, but they were dumbfounded by the snake up close and did not reply him. Useless mother f #curse. Son of Heaven scolded and summoned his red sword, running forward. The gang all summoned their weapons and followed him. Rushing in front of the survivors, Son of Heaven grabbed the eggs and ran towards the mouth of the cave. The snake was originally concerned about its eggs and didn't move. Seeing Son of Heaven running away with them, it went into a rage and left the pool, chasing the gang madly. Block it, cried Son of Heaven, while he kept running without pause. Luo Tianyang was even more ruthless. He grabbed 2 shivering survivors and threw them at the snake. Catching one in the mouth, the snake swallowed him without chewing. The rest of the gang all followed suit, using the survivors as human shields, which temporarily resisted the snake's attack. They took advantage of it and retreated. Son of Heaven ran fast, holding the 2 snake eggs. It took him no time to arrive at the mouth of the cave. When he was excited, a golden fist appeared in front of him and hit him on the face. He hadn't expected someone hiding behind the cave mouth and was unprepared for the attack. Blood spilling and nose crooked, he fell back with his hand covering his face. The 2 snake eggs suddenly flew out from his arms. A golden figure jumped up, caught 1 egg with each hand, and ran toward the river. Son of Heaven fell to the ground, clutching his face. He immediately managed to climb up, saw the unique golden armor and recognized who it was. After jumping in the water, Han Sen had swiftly swum to the shore in the chaos, and instead of going into the cave, he hid behind a boulder and waited until the gang entered the cave. He then followed them and watched. When he saw Son of Heaven running with the eggs, Han Sen gave him a hard punch and captured the eggs. Han Sen just regretted that his bronze crescent spear had been ruined by Shui Longyan, or he might have been able to kill Son of Heaven with this secret attack. Han Sen reached the river and suddenly saw waves roaring. A huge black-scaled snake appeared from the river. F***K, there is another one. Han Sen looked back and saw the other snake chasing the gang. You are so F#ked. Son of Heaven hated Dollar's guts and gloated that he was stopped by the snake. Han Sen quickly had an idea as the snake in the river glared at him. He pushed hard with his right hand secretly, and then threw the snake egg at Son of Heaven. Catch. We will each keep one egg, and let's deal with the snakes together first. Quote, who agreed to that? I will get both eggs and kill you. Thinking Han Sen was terrified, Son of Heaven sneered and caught the egg, but the egg broke when it hit him and the egg was all over him. Son of Heaven was stunned. Super God Gene, Chapter 23, Roar. The giant snake shrieked and rushed madly toward Son of Heaven, who was covered in egg, leaving Han Sen alone. Han Sen turned and ran with the remaining snake egg. Jumping on an inflatable boat, he desperately rowed to the other side without looking back. He still had an egg with him, and if both snakes decided to go for him, it would be no fun at all. $F******, Han Sen heard cursing from behind, followed by all sorts of human voices and the beast's roar. Han Sen went to the other side, jumped onto the shore and ran out of the big gap. Without a pause, he ran toward the shelter. After running for a while, Han Sen started to get uneasy. In case Son of Heaven and his gang escaped, they would definitely go for him, and he could by no means outrun their mounts. Han Sen decided to go into the forest and take a detour so that he didn't risk being caught by them. They had been in the shelter for years, and everyone was fit and had plenty of beast souls. Even though they were no match for the snakes, surely some of them could get away. It was best to be careful. That night, Han Sen found a corner to take shelter from the wind and got some firewood. Sealing the snake egg with a layer of mud, he put it on the fire and barbecued it. While cooking, Han Sen murmured, "Pure life, before you see this dirty world, let me handle the sin and send you back to heaven." Young obsidian dragon killed. No beast soul gained. Eat it to gain 0 to 10 sacred Geno points randomly. Having barbecued it for a while, Han Sen heard the voice. So it was not a snake. Unfortunately I didn't gain the beast soul, Han Sen thought greedily. Soon the egg was cooked and Han Sen used a stick to get the egg out of the fire. Breaking the burnt mud crust on the outside, he saw the delicious egg white. Han Sen took a bite, and the egg was so much better than a chicken egg. Young obsidian dragon eaten. 1 sacred Geno point gained. Han Sen ate the whole egg and was so full he couldn't move. He had gained 5 sacred Geno points. Adding the 8 points he already had, Han Sen now had 13 sacred Geno points. It took Han Sen 8 or 9 days to reach Steel Armor Shelter. Son of Heaven and his gang had been back for 2 days already when he arrived. There were only 8 in the gang that returned alive, and everyone was injured. Even some of Son of Heaven's henchmen had died. Son of Heaven wouldn't say what they had done, and Chinzan and Fist Guy failed to find out. Several hired thugs, however, had come back alive after they had fallen into the water. And through them, Chinzan and Fist Guy eventually learned what had happened. They still had no idea what had happened after the hired men fell into the water, so just took for granted that the gang was hurt by the obsidian dragons. Their guess was only half right, because the egg thrown by Han Sen also contributed a lot to the gang's predicament. After all, they wouldn't have had to fight the dragons if he hadn't done that. Son of Heaven was afraid of being ridiculed, and did not tell what happened later, while secretly he launched a new search for Dollar. It is a pity that Son of Heaven and Luo Tianyang didn't die. Han Sen learned what had happened and felt relieved. He was afraid that Son of Heaven might suspect something, seeing he had returned alone. Now that there were other survivors, Han Sen naturally had nothing to worry about, and caught a primitive copper-toothed beast on his way back to the shelter. If Son of Heaven and his gang came to interrogate him, he could just say he was rushed downstream and got lucky. Han Sen was thinking too much, because Son of Heaven did not have the time to ask him and didn't make the connection at all. More than half a month was spent on the expedition. Han Sen teleported out of God's sanctuary to see his mother and sister. However, at the gate of the transport station, Chinzan was standing at the exit, looking at him coldly. "You sure can hide. It's been more than half a month since I saw you. Do you think I'll spare you from the punishment you deserve? Miss Chin, what do you want?" Han Sen looked at her, depressed. Chinzan was now the station master, and there was no way to bypass her. "Easy, take this and come with me." Chinzan threw a combat suit at Han Sen. "You would not kill me anyway," Han Sen thought, taking the combat suit and following her back to the station. They didn't teleport to God's sanctuary but to the combat room in the station. Han Sen put on the combat suit and entered the room, where Chinzan stood in a red combat suit with black stripes. A combat suit was not just clothing, but a high-tech product that could function as armor, with inbuilt sensors which recorded all data during fighting, including heart rate, breathing, punch speed and the impact taken. This allowed the users to understand their physical status and determine their future practice methods. If you win, I will leave you alone for good. Qinzan curled her finger, indicating Han Sen should attack. You are about to max out on sacred geno points and have so many beast souls. I just graduated, and you have trained in the army for so long. Why don't you just say you want to kill me? Even if Han Sen could win, he didn't want to expose the fact that he was dollar. And he wasn't confident about the fighting. No beast soul allowed, and we are clear if you can still stand after 50 movements, Qinzan said casually. Deal. Han Sen believed he could endure 50 movements if he focused on defense. Super God Gene. Chapter 24. Qinzan had made up her mind to kick Han Sen's ass. The first time, when Han Sen stabbed her in the rear, she could attribute it to his ignorance, while the harassment on the train couldn't be a coincidence. Having identified Han Sen as a freakin' bastard, Qinzan walked up to him with anger in her eyes and said, "You start." Bang! Han Sen punched her in the face. Clutching her nose and stepping back, Qinzan stared at him, not believing what had happened. Han Sen was not like any man she had seen. She let him start and he just immediately punched her, which was completely beyond her expectations. That's why she was not prepared for it. They were standing close to each other, so she was hit on the nose. In her understanding, in a showdown, the two opponents should go to the middle and take their positions. And men always acted as gentlemen in front of her. Even if they were weaker, they'd still want to show their masculinity. No one was like Han Sen, who threw a punch without a sign, hitting her face, where she wasn't even covered by protective gear. I'm sorry, so sorry, have we not started? Hansen repeatedly apologized. He thought he'd let her beat him to let out the anger, and wanted it to end sooner. He didn't expect that he could hit her nose, which soon turned red. We had started, and we'll continue, you, bang. Qinzan had more to say, but he acted hearing, continue, and hit her on the nose again. She was in so much pain she had to squat on the floor. You said continue, so I thought. Han Sen quickly explained, I'll kill you. Qinzan jumped from the ground. Not caring about the rules anymore, she moved forward and started to beat Han Sen up. Resisting Qinzan's beating, Han Sen found his fighting skills were much weaker than Qinzan's, and he couldn't even play defense. He barely got through a dozen punches and was beaten down. Way less than 50. See you next time. Qinzan turned away, leaving behind Han Sen, who was wounded all over. Han Sen stood up with a wry smile on his face. Wearing a combat suit, he wasn't injured seriously. It was just some pain he would have to put up with. The worst part was he seemed to have enraged Qinzan even more. After Han Sen left the station to return home, Qinzan took a shower and was about to delete the video and data of the fight right away. She was the station master and the strongest woman in Steel Armor Sanctuary. There was no way she'd let people see the video of herself being punched in the nose by ass freak. Before deletion, Qinzan watched it again, and she was momentarily shocked. She thought that the reason she was hit was that Han Sen took advantage when she wasn't prepared. After carefully reviewing it several times, Qinzan suddenly found that although this was a very important reason, it couldn't fully explain her being hit. Was it, thought Qinzan, and repeatedly watched the part when he hit her and compared the data collected by the combat suit. So, his fist fighting skills are really poor, just about the normal level of a compulsory education graduate, but his movements were explosive and unexpected, Qinzan mumbled as she was checking the data. And there was something about him, like a killer, before he made a move, I could not predict his intention and that had left me unguarded. When he threw a punch, there wasn't even the slightest change in his emotions, not even when he was hitting hard. The separation of behaviors and emotions should belong to a good assassin, a fatal blow under ordinary cover. No, he just graduated, and there is no way he is an assassin. Also, his movements were too bad for him to be one. So, this separation was just his innate talent. Qinzan could only think of this one possibility. What she didn't know was that Han Sen was really poor when he entered God's sanctuary. At the time he offended both Qinzan and Son of Heaven. No one dared to be with him, and no one dared to trade with him. The new graduate started to hunt creatures using an ordinary alloy dagger, without any experience. Even just ordinary creatures posed great threats to a beginner, not to mention that they often came in groups, so Han Sen must have taken an individual creature by surprise and killed it. Once surrounded by a group, he could only wait to die. To minimize the danger, he had to ambush and attack, and the most important part was not to alert the creatures, who had more acute senses than men. In the first month, Han Sen was honing this skills. In failure after failure, he learned to hide his emotions and intentions, so that the creatures sensed no danger even when he approached. It was like playing dirty, but it was also the only way for him to survive at that point. Later, he had to keep practicing and improve his skills in order to kill primitive creatures, and gradually they became part of his instinct. Although Han Sen's fighting skills were not even close to advanced, he was no worse than a great assassin in his explosiveness and timing. Like an assassin, his skills were also honed between life and death, and the only difference was that it was the creatures instead of men that he killed. Super God Gene, Chapter 25. He seems to have great strength, speed and explosiveness, which indicates that he has fairly high Geno points, unless he is practicing hyper-Geno arts. Qin Zan looked at some data, but didn't worry too much about it. Han Sen's data was indeed better than average, but data like this can be seen anywhere in the shelter. It was only a bit unexpected that it belonged to Han Sen. Talented but vulgar and despicable. I'll just teach him a lesson next time, thought Qin Zan bitterly. Because of Han Sen's sneak attacks, she labeled him as despicable again. It was indeed hard for most people to imagine that Han Sen had integrated the sneak attack skills into his practice and instinct. The reason why Han Sen could hit Son of Heaven in the face was his sneak attack skills. Or else someone like him could never hit Son of Heaven, who had great Geno points and hyper-Geno arts. Sneak attack didn't sound good, but it was practical. When he got home, Han Sen had dinner with his mother and Han Yan. The next day, he did not go to God's sanctuary but took the train to a martial hall. Han Sen had only learned basic martial arts in the past, and those were designed for people who had no Geno points. As one started to gain Geno points in God's sanctuary, one became stronger in general. With the practice of hyper-Geno arts, the body had become even more unique, and this difference allowed people like him to practice certain martial arts that normal people could not practice. These martial arts can be learned at martial halls as well as at advanced colleges. And martial masters who worked at martial halls taught these for a living. Unlike in ancient times, these martial masters did not rely on their inherited fame, nor did they want to leave legacies. Their only goal was to make profit. So, the more money a student spent, the better martial arts were taught. Martial arts all had certain requirements for physical conditioning. If the requirements were not met, it wouldn't be possible to practice. In the past, Han Sen had no money and no significant enhancement in his physical conditioning. Now with 13 sacred Geno points and lots of other Geno points, he had become stronger. The practice of Jideskin had also helped. Now his physical condition was among the best in his peer group. Ares Martial Hall was famous on Roka Planet. The tuition there was very expensive, but the martial arts taught were very good. The owner of the martial hall was a veteran and was famous back in the days when he was serving. After getting severely injured in a battle, he went back to Roka to open Ares Martial Hall. Everyone called the veteran, Old Devil. As long as you paid enough, he would teach you anything, and you could indeed learn some really good skills. Young man, want to learn something? We have elementary classes, intermediate classes, advanced classes and special classes here. You can learn fist fighting, weapon skills, and even hyper-Geno arts here. For an elementary class, you could choose to learn a martial art that I define as elementary for $10,000. For an intermediate class, you could choose a martial art that I define as intermediate for $100,000. Advanced classes are each for $1 million, and special classes are each for $10 million. At these prices, I could guarantee a good learning outcome. Fellow, you look like you have a bright future ahead of you. Do you want to sign up for all special classes? All 12 martial arts for only $50 million. Old Devil looked at Han Sen with a greedy smile, like a dragon looking at gold. I would like to sign up for an advanced class to learn Ghost Hound. Han Sen came here for a reason. His dad had learned from Old Devil and told him Old Devil has a great martial art called Ghost Hound. Unfortunately, his dad's physical condition hadn't reached the required level for Ghost Hound, so he couldn't learn it. He always had regretted that and asked Han Sen to learn Ghost Hound when he grew up. Han Sen also heard from his father that Ghost Hound was especially effective on women. Han Sen had once again offended Qin Zan, and it didn't look like she would let it go easily. Not willing to be bullied by her, he thought of his father's words about Old Devil and Ghost Hound and wanted to take the opportunity. After all, $1 million was a piece of cake for him right now. Although Ghost Hound is among the most advanced, its requirements were even higher than those of special classes. You must at least max out on mutant geno points to stand a chance. How fit are you? Old Devil looked at Han Sen in surprise. No one had chosen Ghost Hound in a while because of its high entry barrier. You can test me to see if I can meet the standards. Han Sen was not sure whether he would pass either. Technically, with 13 sacred geno points, he should be more fit than those who had maxed out on mutant geno points. 10,000 test fee for a physical fitness test. Old Devil placed a card reader in front of Han Sen. Han Sen took out his credit card and paid 10,000, and Old Devil was quite pleased by his generosity. After scanning and testing in a dozen instruments, the test result was out, which slightly surprised Old Devil. Your physical fitness is very good. You must have almost maxed out on ordinary, primitive and mutant geno points. Can I learn Ghost Hound? Han Sen gave no reply, as his mutant geno points were less than 10, and sacred geno points and Jadeskin would explain his fitness. Yes, 1 million. Old Devil did not ask further, placing the card reader once again in front of Han Sen. While a bit upset about spending his hard-earned money, Han Sen paid for it. Young man, you have great things lined up for you. Come with me. You'll have to memorize Ghost Hound first. Old Devil showed Han Sen into a screening room, turned on the hologram and left him alone in the room. It was Old Devil himself practicing Ghost Hound in the hologram. Han Sen looked for a while, and his eyes widened. He thought to himself, wow, so that's what you mean by, especially effective on women, Dad.